And I'm thankful that folks have joined us for a conversation about Solar All, because what we know is that renewable energy has an incredible opportunity to help those who most need it reduce their energy burdens and costs. But we also have significant challenges in making sure that everyone can equitably access those benefits. And so I'm thankful to have with me today folks can in more detail introduce themselves, but I'll just do a quick down the line and they'll talk more about their work when their turn comes up. But going here from right to left, Clary Franco from Sun Common, Nathan Phelps from Vote Solar, Krista Shutt from Vermont Law School, Kevin McAllister from Catamount Solar, and Steve Geller from SEVCA, the Southeast Vermont Community Action Agency. And for those who are unfamiliar, Vermont's Clean Energy Access Coalition is co-facilitated by Renewable Energy Vermont's Education Fund and Burlington Electric Department, with the goal of lowering energy burdens for everyone and increasing participation of all Vermonters in the total renewable energy innovation and transformation. And as you can see, we have a very diverse coalition of folks that are participating with us, some of whom are here in the audience, some of whom are, well, we're all here, we're not an audience, we're all here together actually to talk about solutions, and some are at the table with me from all across the state, and we have a set list of values document. You can learn more about our work on our website, revermont.org/forall. But why don't what we're going to do is get started with talking about some of the specific projects that are either underway or have already been completed in Vermont, New Hampshire, and other states around the country. Solar projects that were intentionally designed to primarily or exclusively benefit low and moderate income households. And why don't do you want to take it away, Steve, with talking about your work?
Sure.
Ansley, you'll pull up your PowerPoint and maybe give a little wave or say next slide.
Whistle. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for setting this up, and I appreciate creating the opportunity for me to talk about this really exciting project that we're doing at SEVCA. Let me first preface everything by saying I have a commitment I have to run to in eastern Massachusetts tonight, so I'm going to have to leave pretty much right after my presentation. Kevin, who's Catamount Solar, is the installer of our project, so we'll have some interaction in our presentation. But I've got a little packet of material on this end of the table there, so if you want to pick that up before I leave, I'm going to scoop them up before I go, and I've got a business card there if you want to get it in, so you can contact me later to get more details. This project, which we're calling Community Solar for Community Action, is a pilot project, and hopefully the vision is that we hope this will be a replicable national model for low-income energy assistance as a partial alternative to the fossil fuel-based assistance that we now see through the LIHEAP grant and other means. It's a partnership with between SEVCA and an organization called the Rural Renewable Energy Alliance, or RREAL is its acronym. They call themselves REAL. We spent months calling them RREAL, but I really think, when I look at the word, it really should be a Spanish Real. It has a rolling R with a double R at the front. So whatever you call it, they are an organization that really has an incredible vision of creating this national workable model for replacing a good portion of what is now the standard for the LIHEAP program and other sources of low-income energy assistance with renewable-based assistance, solar being one of the major, if not the major, source of it. And their vision is to work with community action agencies across the country because we, for those who don't know, the community action agencies were formed as part of the War on Poverty by LBJ in 1964, and we cover pretty much all of the entire nation. 99.9% of all counties are covered by a community action agency. So we're a natural partner to be able to reach all of the people who would be most in need and would be the ones to benefit from a renewable-based energy assistance program. Go ahead, next one. As many of you know, the energy cost burden in this country is very unequal and very harmful for many families who can't afford, just as with housing, when they pay more than 30%, more than 50%, more than 70% in many cases of their income on housing. Many families are paying disproportionate portions of their income on energy. And it's a little tough to see, I know, for a lot of you in the back, but I just want to create a visual understanding that these are all gradations of people at or below the poverty level. And the percentage of their income devoted to energy can run up above 50%, believe it or not, all the way at the other end of the spectrum to perhaps 7–8%. By comparison, people in the middle, in the mainstream, are typically paying between 2 and 3% of their income or less on energy. So it's already a tremendously unequal and unfair burden on people who can least afford it. And unfortunately, renewable energy has been out of reach of all the people who would most benefit from it, low-income households. Go ahead. So that leads to the disparity that we know of people in poverty having to make this, whether you want to call it Sophie's choice or Hobson's choice of heating or eating, paying the rent or getting health care, being able to get clothing and the basic necessities they need, or buying a tank of oil. Heat or eat is sort of the symbol of what people are facing every day. Go ahead. And as we know, energy assistance today, primarily it comes through the national federal LIHEAP program, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Put a lot of money into it. It's been fortunate over the years. It's gone up and down, but it hasn't gotten significant cuts from its typical amount of funding year to year. But what it does do is focus primarily on energy powered by fossil fuels, because that's the way the system was set up, and it continues with that momentum to be set up that way. So the question is, yes, the next one, is energy assistance as it exists today the solution we're looking for, or, next, that's kind of what, just those of you who already know what it's causing to our environment and our climate. And the question that is posed is then, next slide, is there a better solution? Soul being the Latin word for sun, of course. Real, and many of us who have been working in this field think there is, and the answer is to power energy assistance through renewable energy. And so in that vein, we got together with Real through a number of connections that we made, first on a local basis in our area in Vermont, and then broadened out through our connections and various networks to bring Real into the mix. So go ahead. Thank you. We think that solar energy can be a powerful tool in the fight against poverty. Next slide. And out of that comes community solar for community action, which we hope to be a low-carbon, long-term, sustainable solution to energy poverty. Go ahead. This is too hard to see. It just sketches out sort of the line in terms of the development of this program, from the original ideas to the building of the array, in our case by Catamount Solar, Sevka being the owner and manager of the facility. And rather than look to a solution where the utility would be governing the way this happens and then giving us a small discount, the part of the solution long-term is to have organizations like ours, and for us, we hope they are community action agencies, as the premier anti-poverty network in our country, that will result in our clients, the most vulnerable low-income households in the country, being the beneficiaries. So I'll get to the specifics of our project. That's our headquarters, our main office in Westminster. And what you see there is the artist's rendering. Part of this is now, doesn't have to be rendered, it actually exists. Catamount Solar has completed the ground-mounted portion in the upper part of the slide. The rest of it is the rendering of what the roof-mounted slides would look like. And it amounts to, based on the requirement in Vermont, of about just less than 15% of the total capacity being on the ground, and the rest of it, the 85% being on the roof. So we started out as phase one. Go ahead. Catamount came in and we got all the permits, everything that was needed, the certificate of public good, and they started building the frame. Keep going. Made it, got it to where it was going to hold those panels, and keep going. Started putting the panels on and ended up with a completed array. This looks like it might have taken a long time, but it was actually, I think, 2.5 days. Is that about right? Yes. Yeah, it would amaze all of us how quickly it went up. It was like watching Henry Ford in the original Model A plan. It was just clockwork. They did it. It was really a tremendously systematic and efficient process. We also go ahead. We call that phase one, and we wanted to get that out into the public eye. We wanted to dedicate that part of the project so we could really get the momentum to continue on. And we had a dedication ceremony, which included the players you see there, include the children of Harold Schmidtke, to whom the project was dedicated. I'll give you more information about that in a minute. Marion Major, who's the sister of Polly Major from Senator Leahy's office. She's with the Wyndham Regional Commission, which gave us a big chunk of the funding for this, and bless them for that. Senator Becca Ballant, Representative David Dean, who has always been a strong environmental and climate advocate, and who coincidentally used to be director of Sevka in the late 70s and early 80s, and who created a number of projects through the CETA program and others of energy efficiency work, including what has become a famous symbol of Sevka, the Sevka stove, which was made from old propane tanks. And people still call today, 30, 40 years later, asking if we're still making the Sevka stoves, wood stoves. And also, we had Sheila Reed, legislative representative from Senator Sanders' office, and Senator Alice Nitka, who joined us for that dedication. And go ahead. We dedicated it in the memory of Harold Schmidtke, who was our weatherization director for 25 years, and last year passed away due to a long bout with cancer. But we wanted to really have this be a symbol of the work he did for so many years and dedication that he exhibited to energy efficiency and saving and reducing the energy cost burden for so many of the people that we serve. Go ahead. Tell me if I'm starting to get into other people's time. The progress we've made on it, as I said, we completed phase one, the ground mounted. We had been struggling to raise all the money, and we have recently surpassed our goal. So we're ready to go forward and continue. We got a wide variety of funders and people who donated, including the Regional Planning Commission, V-Light, a lot of private foundations, several large individual donors, and the response publicly and from private sources was tremendous, well beyond our expectations, and we were very pleased. We honestly didn't know at some point whether we would be able to raise all the money for this, and I think it's a good symbol that we were able to do it, and people were very excited about contributing to it. Go ahead. Part of the challenge was that in the course of getting bids, we were informed by a number of the bidders, including Catamount, that the project wouldn't work at the size we had designated it originally because of changes or our misunderstanding of the Vermont regulations. So we downsized it from 150 kilowatts to 110 kilowatts, and that also was serendipitous in allowing us to raise enough money for it. We also needed repair on our roof trusses, which was one of the other reasons we had to delay the roof-mounted portion. I'm pleased to announce that that work has now been done. The engineer is coming back on Monday to inspect it, and if he gives it the go-ahead, then Catamount's going to schedule their return to do all the roof panels, and we're very excited to continue on. And then finally, the challenge of the program design. In other words, how we're going to serve people, who we're going to serve, what the threshold for eligibility is going to be, and so on. Go ahead. So we're looking, and we're in that process right now, trying to determine who the target population is going to be, what the eligibility determination is going to look like, how much assistance we're going to give to each individual household, how it's going to be integrated with weatherization and our energy efficiency coaching, and also the issue around housing stability because of the Vermont regulations about how many times we can change the distribution of the energy credits that are being developed, which is limited to 4 times a year, and therefore we can't have people coming in and out at a rapid pace. We have to have some level of stability among the people we serve, and that has to be one of the criteria we need to look at. Go ahead. So I'm not going to go into all the details about this, but just on a very high level to tell you that these are the things we're looking at as we wrestle with how we best target this. We want to serve the people with the highest energy cost burdens, but we also don't want to make it so complicated and so data burdened that people, the individuals will be turned off and our staff will have a difficult time. The administrative burden of operating it will be so great that it'll start to, erode the benefit of the program. So we're wrestling with that question next. In terms of how we target it, the easiest thing would be, because it's generating electricity, to target households that heat with electricity, which would be easy to identify and easy to reach out to through the utility and through the fuel assistance program. But we also then may not reach the people who most need it, because electricity is only one source of their energy, and not often, except for those who heat with electricity, not often the one they spend the most money on. So we're wrestling with how to balance that next. We're looking at whether to target households that are not eligible for state and federal LIHEAP and other sources of fuel assistance, because we want to balance it. We want to have a fair distribution of all of the resources. But again, that may be fair in that sense, but it also may not be providing the assistance to those who are most vulnerable and who need it to the greatest extent. So we're trying to figure out a way to make that work in the most balanced way. Go ahead. We also want to make sure that the energy that we're creating through this project and then donating or distributing to these households is used in the most efficient way. So in part, we'd like to make sure that it's going to people whose homes have been weatherized or are willing to have them weatherized through our program at no cost. But then, and also who have gone through our energy coaching process, so that we're getting the best bang for the buck in terms of the efficiency of the energy that's being generated. On the other hand, we don't want to necessarily funnel all of these bundle of benefits to very few people who are getting all of that vertical bundle of services. So we want to try to be balanced in that. And then finally, the question of housing stability, next one, that we're looking at, and Kevin can talk a little bit more about this, I think, in terms of how the state regulation about how often we can change the distribution, where the credits go. which is limited to 4 times a year, as I said. And so if we have a great deal of instability of transients, and what happens when people leave, and it's not at the point where we're ready to submit a mass of changes to the utility for where the credits are going, at some point we will we'll either be at the point where we're producing credits which don't go to anybody if the number of households are no longer there, and they can't go back to us for our use. They will go back to the utility, who will get them, and they won't be going for the purpose that they were designed for. So we're trying to figure out how to do that without penalizing people who are often the most vulnerable when they're the most when their housing is the most unstable. Almost there. In all of this, we're trying to figure out how to make this model self-sustaining. One of the things we looked at initially was, and the ultimate goal is still, to try to get the feds to agree to allow LIHEAP funds to be used for these projects. We went to them we went to the state fuel office to get them to agree to allow us to try to do that. They were very enthusiastic about it, I have to say. They were very supportive. They went to the feds and made the case, and the feds said, nah, it's very unorthodox. We don't do that. We haven't done that. We made a case, I think, collectively, that was a good one, that this wasn't, the money that we were getting from LIHEAP was not going for the construction of the installation of the panels. It was going to reserve credits for households that were eligible for LIHEAP for at least 25 years, the life of the project. And logistically and legally, that was a good case to make, I think, because that helps to stabilize the LIHEAP funding for many years for a good part of the population being served. The feds aren't there yet. We think if we get a good model going and they see that it works and the costs of operating it over the years are very minimal, as we expect they would be, and it does really produce this electricity and gives it to people for 25 years, we'll begin to see that. I think they'll start looking at it a different way, particularly if we start to replicate it in other places across the country. Go ahead. And we're also looking at other funding models, such as a pay for success model of funding, which is folks from REAL could explain that better than I could, but it's basically a way of getting private investors to invest in this kind of project, just as they invest in low-income housing through the low-income housing tax credits, and they get benefits based on the success of how well the project generates the electricity and gets it to the target population. So a number of things we're looking at, always looking at new ways to think about it and to innovate, and very encouraged about how it's gone so far. It hasn't been easy, but it's been a steady, incremental move towards success, and we feel confident that we're going to have it fully up and running by the end of April or into May, when Catamount can get out and finish the roof work, or the roof panels, and we'll be starting to get that benefit out to people who most need it. So I've got information about how to contact me if you so desire to get more information. I've got my card on the table with the packet of materials, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has now if I can. I can't answer a lot of the technical questions, but I'm happy to take it back to our team, and if something comes up that I can find out more about. Thank you.
Well, Kevin, I think you're hitting your mark, so I do want to make sure if anyone has any questions for Steve, that we have time to ask any questions. Anyone from here that has?
Ralph Lima with Green Lantern. We're a Rev member. Very happy to see Rev taking the initiative with this session. I live in Brattleboro, and I'd like to come and speak to you outside of this, but I just wanted to mention that over the past couple of years, we've tried to develop solar projects with, basically community solar where individuals can buy blocks of capacity.
Right.
And these were market priced. They weren't attempts to price them or make them available to low income folks, but we still found them very hard to sell, and I went away from the attempt with the impression that only very affluent people either have the cash or the capacity to borrow and the ability to borrow to finance either panels on their own roofs or on their own property, or part of a community, ownership of part of a community array. And so I'd just like to encourage you to think and sort of encourage everyone to see a much, much longer continuum from really, really low income people right on up to people who could buy a car with a car loan if they needed to, or who could finance a roof repair on their house.
Sliding scale sort of model.
But choose not to go forward with solar because there's so many other competing uses of their scarce borrowing capacity and cash. That it's a much bigger problem. It covers a much bigger spectrum of the socioeconomic scale.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting. I understand that others could probably fill in more detail, but I understand that the state has made it more difficult for general community solar projects to get started now. And I don't know if we had waited another year that we might have had more difficulty doing it. I'm not sure if it would have affected the particular kind of project we're doing. But I've heard from others when I've done presentations, for instance, at the VCAN conference, that they had tried to do or started one, and then they were told they could no longer do it the way they had designed it originally. So if anybody knows more about that, I'd be happy to. I'd love to hear what the story is behind that.
I'll speak to that a little bit more too, and then I bet it'll be part of the policy conversation that we have around bigger years.
And I know that Lori is here from VSCCU, and they are one of the primary funders, particularly for residential solar projects. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to in response to Ralph's question, things that you've seen, because you deal directly with a lot of customers in the financing space.
It really is more of a, you really have to look at each borrower or each applicant. I mean, I think we need to be careful when we're talking about, low income, that doesn't necessarily mean low asset. And sometimes, it's not a matter of they can't take out a loan. It's a matter that they don't want to. So it's a priority issue. We really, work with customers from, all walks of life. And, we don't have a minimum credit score. We work with people that, we have, and lots of the solar folks in the room are partners of ours. And, we really work hard to try to get financing in the hands of people that want to do this, and renewables are an important part of what they want to do. So, I think it is a matter of looking at the whole picture for somebody, and not just their credit score or, other factors. I'm happy to answer more questions, but it's not really just a simple answer. But we honestly, I have a $54 million portfolio on the residential side. So, for us, we find ways to work with all sorts of different kinds of Vermonters to get what they want. It might mean that exactly what happened with Steve. Sometimes we do work with them to maybe do a smaller project. And solar companies have been great, working with us on that at times. Maybe it's a little bit smaller project that they really can afford. We also underwrite the savings, so if we can see that it's offsetting their power bill, their energy bills, we calculate that in their debt-to-income ratio.
Well, why don't we, thank you so much, Steve. Kevin, what? Yeah, Kevin, do you want to?
Thanks. So I'm Kevin McAllister, founder and managing partner at Catamount Solar. We're a full-service solar design and installation company based in Randolph, Vermont. We were fortunate to be selected to be the contractor to build the array at SEVCA. It was an open competitive RFP process, and both SEVCA and Real made the decision to use us based, I think, on the value that we provided to their project, as well as the fact that we operate as a workers' cooperative, so we have a strong community sense and ideals for helping and giving back to the community, and gave a quite good price for the system because we liked the low-income aspect that it provided. That's really the extent of our involvement in this project. However, I'd been thinking about low-income solar and how to get it out further into the community, and had been talking several years ago with Julie Ifland at the Randolph Area Community Development Corporation, which owns several mobile home parks as well as other low-income properties, because they were also very interested in doing this, and had spun this idea back then about, well, what if the community action agencies or community development organizations that have access or have a direct relationship with these low-income clients, if they could somehow be the intermediaries to distribute excess net metering credits in the state, which essentially is the project that SEPCA has taken on. I think it's going to be a really a good model for doing that. One of the challenges is, what makes it possible is that Vermont has not just a good net metering program, but a group net metering program. And so by group net metering means that the credits that are generated by one system can potentially be shared to another system. And in Vermont, sometimes that happens on a big commercial basis where somebody builds a giant field, a businessman or investor builds a big solar field and then sells the credits at a discount to other people that need the power. In this case, it also is very beneficial for farms. For example, I have a small farm in East Montpelier with 2 meters, right? A meter for the house and a meter for the barn. The solar goes into the barn meter, but I can share those credits across both the barn and the house without adding all kinds of extra wiring and electronics or having to split the system into 2 parts. So it's very, very progressive, and it's a great program. But it doesn't really envision this idea of having an intermediary support organization that might be collecting all of the credits and then redistributing them out to other off-takers who, in this case, are low-income folks. Steve alluded to the idea. So I think that potentially there's a couple of small little tweaks or fixes to the rule or that could help enable this to happen. Steve mentioned the challenge of the limited number of times that you're able to reallocate the credits with the utility. GMP, somebody maybe correct me if I'm wrong, GMP told Steve that it's 4 times a year. I think the rule says twice a year. Is that, do you know that? Or Jim?
I thought you could change it once a month.
Oh, yeah.
I think
I wish
it's,
that was true.
Anyway, what's that? 4 times?
Either way, we'll look that up.
It used to be
and-
2. Maybe
Yeah.
one of the recent changes turned it to 4.
Sources of
It does change now.
But still, if it's 4 times a year, like Steve said, the population that they serve can be somewhat transient, more than the general population, and it might not be to their advantage to have to wait to have to reallocate until the next time when they have a group to do that. The other limitation under the way the current group net metering rules are formulated is one group can have many sources of power, but each person can only be in one group. And so to make one group with all these, with potentially different sources of power could help the community action programs, because why should they just have to build one big system at their site in order to serve their clients? There might be other sites that have excess power and they would like to donate it to the community action to serve low-income people. The wealthier folks that Ralph was talking about who are building a system might have extra space on their roof and be willing to put up an extra 5 or 10 panels and then send it off to one of these intermediary organizations. But again, it's under the current rules, it's really hard to configure that. It's probably not going to happen, you know, unless there's a specific carve-out for this type of low-income program with these community intermediary organizations that will manage the credits that will allow them to take the excess power. Another enabling tweak could be, you know, there's people that already have excess power, and they get to the end of the year, and if they haven't already set up a group to maybe share the power with their neighbor or maybe with their church, they've got excess credits at the end of the year. Current rules don't let you say, send so many credits to community action or somewhere else. You need to have your group set up so that it's every month 10% goes to one off-taker or another. It would be advantageous if somebody had extra credits at the end of the year to be able to just tell the utility, okay, please send these to SEPCA for their program. Likewise, the rules state that if you have a credit on your system, if you have a solar system and you have credits that sit in your account for more than 12 months, they just go back to the utility. I've never heard a number, but I bet it's out there somewhere that there's a sizable number of net metering credits that the utilities take back from month to month. Maybe they should be required to put them into low income to programs like this. They could probably get a tax break for doing that if they have little motivation or prod. I don't know. Anyway, those are my ideas, both the challenges and opportunities. I think it's a great model. Wish Steve all the best. We're looking forward to getting back there probably in April to build the roof system, and hope it can take off in other places.
Well, it's been great working with Catamount. We've really we've gained from that relationship, and we look forward to working with you some more. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Sorry,
I've got to leave also at 3. I apologize. I'm taking off my family.
Most of these unless somebody wants me to leave.
But I'll stick around for 10 more minutes.
All right, well, let's keep going and talk about a couple other projects. Clary, you have some different models and things that you've done at SunCommon. Why don't you share with us?
Wonderful. My name is Clary Kirka. I lead our marketing team at SunCommon. And this is great. Thank you all for being here and having this conversation. And thank you, Olivia and Rev, for facilitating. So, for anyone who isn't familiar with SunCommon, we're a mission-based solar company founded in 2012. We're a benefit corporation. Our mission is to dramatically increase solar in Vermont. We believe that all of Vermonters should have access to a healthy environment and a brighter future, and that clean energy is where that starts. So our mission is to tear down barriers to renewable energy and use our business as a force for good. And within that, we absolutely aim to serve all Vermonters. So when we launched in 2012, we offered a very singular product, is rooftop solar. That served a certain percentage of people, and then throughout time, we've been able to bring in more and more products to serve a greater population. So there was about a year and a half where we were offering community solar. So that idea, like Kevin was talking about, group net metering, one large array that a lot of people, a lot of residential folks are allowed to buy into. In that, yeah, it was either a year and a half. We actually served almost 1,000 Vermont households. That program was hugely significant in being able to really toss away barriers. So that's a subscription style community solar array where you have no upfront cost, you have fixed monthly payments with guaranteed savings, it's easy in, it's easy out. For renters or folks who move, and other benefits. And one thing I wanted to say is, within this conversation around solar and making it accessible to low and moderate income folks, actually very, yeah, thanks. Within that conversation of making solar accessible, there are a lot of ways that solar is incredibly accessible, so there's more we need to do to make it really work for low and moderate income folks. But I don't want the big takeaway to be solar isn't accessible to people. So I, and Becca White, one of our state reps, is also works on the marketing team at SunCommon and in the outreach program, and I'm sure you have tons of examples too of the people that we've met from all walks of life. So one of the first folks that I ever worked with in Milton is is the family, the only income provider is actually on disability, and that was when they chose to go solar. And every time I run into them in the community, they just have, right, like those savings mean even more to them. So I can think of people that are on food stamps, a lot of other people that solar has worked for, especially when it comes to the community solar program. So I wanted to start with that. I think solar is important, is accessible. And there's actually a study that I found that the Environmental Defense Fund put out just last year, saying that middle income folks are actually the primary adopters of solar right now. So the median income of folks going solar during the study was between 40 and 90,000. So very, very general neighborhoods in the US where this is working. The really big barrier that we find, it actually does come down to credit score really often. That's one of the thresholds that limits folks from being able to get that financing, whether it's community solar or buying at their own home. So we had a few things that we wanted to test and figure out basically if we could prove this worked. When it comes down to credit score, the biggest key is that you need third-party financiers. So with third-party financing, the households don't have to take on any extra debt. They don't have to. They don't have to have a tax appetite, and it is more flexible if they're moving or renters. So we now give me the next slide. Thank you. So we, through a great partnership with Green Mountain Power, were able to run a pilot that went live right at the end of 2017. So we're just a year through right now. So our goals were to show that low to moderate income households would pay bills on time, that this wasn't an extra risk, and that credit score isn't that only indicator of risk. And then the third thing was, as Steve was talking about, that churn rate wasn't so much that it created a lot of administrative burdens and challenges like Kevin was talking about with having to refill the arrays too often. So this specific program was on one of Green Mountain Power service centers down in Middlebury. It wasn't a very large array. I forgot to look back at the exact numbers. I think it was about 85 kilowatts, where we were able to reserve 50% of that array for low and moderate income households. We worked with partners like CVOEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, as well as NeighborWorks of Southern Vermont, to help us design this program, figure out what was going to make sense for these households, and then what exactly that threshold would be. So we landed at the 200% of federal poverty level was the folks that we allowed in, so at or below that. And we found a local investor who was okay, another mission-driven person. They were okay with taking on this risk, with wanting to understand what the outcome was and if this was another viable opportunity to bring more solar to Vermont. We actually offered these folks the exact same community solar program that we had offered to those about 1,000 customers previously. That same model is what we were able to work out. The only difference was because the array went live in the winter, we offset those first few months of bills to make sure that they weren't paying any extra before the system started heavily producing. Otherwise, same program. Next slide, thank you. So a few things that we learned. It was really important to have third-party validation. So Green Mountain Power, they have work that they do with folks at or below a certain threshold of income level, and they promoted this program to them. So they had, these folks had their trusted resource at their utility already suggesting it. Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity promoted this to their folks that they work with, and then same thing with NeighborWorks. And that was really important because when you're working with a population of people who have always felt like solar is not for me, that's for the others, it was really important to have that validation and that encouragement that they should have the conversation with us and explore it. And so far so good. So 1 year in, we've had perfect bill payment, which is shocking and amazing. And it's a 5% churn rate compared to a general 3%. This is a really small sample size, so that 5% actually just means that one person left. So still big questions there and figuring out what's going to be the long-term churn. And bottom line is there was a lot of interest. There was great interest. We actually filled the array within, I think, about a month of marketing and then having those conversations and signing folks up. We're trying to get folks interconnected before the end of the year, so sometimes we move quickly. But it was incredible interest. So state regulations just have to change so that we can do this. We can do the next slide. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about state regulations. But first wanted to say, so we actually, cont expanded into New York last year. So now we started doing a lot of work down there. One of the reasons that we wanted to go into that market is because they have a thriving community solar array program and setup. So they have, NYSERDA as their state regulation, energy regulators, they have a Solar for All program where with state funds, they actually offer 35 cents per installed watt that goes as, so anyone who's buying an array, that's an immediate kickback that they get, as well as they have a community solar program where folks at or below a certain income threshold actually can sign up for 10 free years of community solar array membership. So incredible support for low and moderate income folks taking advantage of solar. And then just in general, their community solar program allows a scale of programs that just make it incredibly cost effective. So there's an array proposed down there, a township in the Hudson Valley where the town can offset all of their needs with just 15% of the array, leaving 85% that gets to be subscription style for their community. Just an incredible example of getting more folks to take advantage of this. And that's not even a low and moderate income program, but it's just a way that gets more people in. And then we're going to reserve a certain section for low and moderate income because we think the financials are going to work in pieces. Next slide. Oop, thought I had one more slide. In summation, the state regulations that shifted, making community solar not a viable option, that's what needs to shift. Right now, these larger arrays that have a carve out for residential opportunity, those just, we don't have high enough compensation, we don't have any support to make those happen. I think that's the biggest thing we can do to be able to bring back community solar and therefore have a really good program for low and moderate income folks. And then I like some of the other ideas that were thrown out to me.
Thank you. Well, why not, let's keep going. Krista has come from law school. You're going to talk about some projects that Energy Clinic has been working on.
Yep. So I'm going to touch on two things. One is the law school has put out a report called the Low Income Solar Ownership in Vermont, Overcoming Barriers to Equitable Access. And so I'm going to touch on some of those barriers, and then I'm going to talk about the project. You can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about the projects that we've done in New Hampshire. So New Hampshire actually has some good policy for low income. They passed a bill called SB 129 that allocates 15% of their renewable energy fund to low and moderate income pieces. You can just keep on the first slide.
Sorry, that was my fault.
It's okay. So I'm going to go through that project and the advantages that we see there. So you can go to the next slide. So we already talked about a little bit earlier about why it matters. I'll just throw a couple more statistics out there. Nearly 30% of Vermonters are low income. 45 to 50% will never qualify for the federal tax credit. They'll never be able to take that on their taxes. 35% of children are low income. 40% of children under 6. So those are some difficult numbers. And the issue about energy burden, it's one of the things that the law school tries to stress is the importance of ownership. So that long-term ownership, it's not just about the credits today. When a person makes an investment in efficiency and they make an investment in solar, they are making an investment in the future, right? So they're going to get better pricing now, but they're also going to get much better pricing in 10 years or 15 years or whenever their array has been finished paid for. And that's going to last for probably 40 years. So the people that are getting the sustainability, the people that are getting, they're going to have the same price, right? Their solar is going to keep producing energy at the same cost over time as electric bills continue to go up. And we need that price stability to go to our low and moderate income folks. And so that's part of the importance of thinking about how can we bring ownership to low income families as well. And the graph is the same graph that Steve showed earlier. So go ahead, sorry. So the barriers that we've identified, some of them are obvious: upfront capital cost. We've talked about financing today, and you know, I'm going to do another shout out to VSECU because they have done a great job and they've got a great program. But part of the issue is not just about can you get financing, but as Lori pointed out, do you want financing? And part of the issue when you're a low-income person is that statistically you are moving every 2 years instead of every 10 years, which is the average for middle and upper income folks. So if you're going to move, if you don't know where your job is going to be, if you're going to continue to shift, then do you want to make that long-term investment in a solar array that's going to take those, you know, the 5 years, even if you can make all of the numbers work so that they're cash flow positive? So one of the things that we suggest in here is looking at on-bill financing for certain segments of the population, low to moderate income and those who rent houses. And that's a financing mechanism that uses the utility, and by financing through the utility, the individual homeowners are not taking loans. The actual loan is going to the meter. In other words, the utility is making an investment in that home. So I'm not going to get into that very much more because it's more complicated than we're going to get into in 10 minutes. But to just say that it does address the rental issues, and it addresses the issue of not being willing to invest in a fixed location over a longer period of time. Others include the lack of information and time and trust, just understanding, is this a good deal? And a lot of times people will be faced with, hey, this is a great lease opportunity, you don't have to pay any money down, but they don't understand what they're looking at in terms of accelerated costs. So the project, the things that work in New Hampshire, go ahead to the next slide. This is Muskoma Meadows, and we built a 100 kilowatt array for a mobile manufactured home park. There are 50 lots. There are 48 homes in this array, in this park. And it's a cooperative-based home, so it's a residential-owned community. It's a cooperative that owns the land underneath. And so in this situation, the SB 129 allows for 15% of that renewable energy fund to go to low-income housing, to low-income solar projects. So we were able to get a grant for this community for $150,000 and to build the array. So a couple of things here. When we talk about intermediary supporting organizations, this cooperative serves as its own intermediary supporting organization. One of the advantages in New Hampshire is that the payout can go to the group host, and the group host can then distribute it to all its community members. So here, the cooperative, and that's the board signing the contract papers on the lower right, but the cooperative receives the money from the utility every month for the group net metering. And every month they distribute that money to their members by reducing their lot rent. So their members aren't facing an income increase, they're just getting an expense increase. But that's a significant difference from Vermont, where you can only see an on-bill credit. Why does an on-bill credit not work for low income? You can't credit the bill and then ask the low-income person to pay the solar developer or the entity that's holding, or the entity that's the host. guarantee you that when it's not connected to your utility bill, the developer is not going to accept the risk of whether or not that individual homeowner is going to make the payment. So when the money comes to the supporting intermediary organization, in this situation the cooperative that is owned by the members, then it's able to distribute it itself. So that's one of the differences that can happen, is the ability to pay out on community solar to the host. The second thing that I want to mention about the commitment of funds in New Hampshire to low moderate, it's a low moderate. The 200% federal poverty level cliff is really a cliff, and they extended that by going to 300%. So even though most programs do only go to 200% federal poverty level, this one for the solar goes to 300%, and the reason was to extend the benefit. So in this community, I think over 85% of the folks in this community were within that 300% threshold, and then there were a few over it. So next slide.
And put that in some context for us. What is that? What 300% for folks that may not be as familiar?
What does 300% represent?
Yeah.
For a family of 4.
So for a family of 4,
Or 2, or any.
Yeah.
Does anyone?
I have a chart right here.
Actually, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay. I have a chart.
So you guys use on its own.
So 4 people.
Actually, pretty much. I think I know where it is.
So for a family of 4, 200% is 48,000 and 300% is 72,000. And for a 2-person family, that's 48,000. So you're talking about 72,000 for a family of 4 is 300% of the poverty level, versus 48,000 for a family of 4 is 200%. So, and most programs end at 200%. And so some of the biggest issues are the people that are facing that sit between 200 and 300% of poverty. Okay, so a big part of it was community participation. Everybody voted, everybody was involved. Next slide. Can you just go forward 6? There, thanks. Didn't mean to have those like that. One more, thank you. So another important piece in New Hampshire is there is not a REF penalty. So the community wanted to go solar, and if you want to have solar energy, that means you keep the renewable energy credits. That's what it means to have solar energy. And in New Hampshire, they're not penalized for keeping their solar RECs, and so the community has kept their RECs, and they're very proud of that. And I'll give you a slide later that shows we educate them on what that means and what the money is. With this project, we also leveraged the federal tax credits by getting impact investors. So we had impact investors that came in that were willing to take a lower return. They got around 9% return, and that enabled us to leverage that 30% federal tax credit, which otherwise would have sat on the table. So this helped the state funds go farther. There was funding through the PUC, which I've said, and the members received their benefits through the lot rent reduction. And the last piece that I'll say, and is a really important piece for this, is that when they sign their group net metering agreement, the individuals commit to energy efficiency education twice a year, and they commit that if any implementation measures are provided that are cost effective, and that means cash flow positive day 1, not just like, oh, this will pay back within a certain period of time, but cash flow positive day 1, that they'll implement it. So many of the homes received measures. This array went live in December. Many of the homes received measures in December. for lighting, and then they'll do their audits this spring and then happen throughout the year. So there's a lot of energy efficiency implementation and then energy efficiency education that's gone along with it. So next slide. This is the 50 lots, and this is the solar array that went in next, and that's the progression, and that's the finished array on November 7th. Next. This is the model. So the utility pays Muskoma Meadows Cooperative the amount every month. And this was an important piece to developers. And the developer in this case acts as the fiscal agent and accepts the check from Liberty and then gives the remaining funds to Muskoma, who distributes it to the residents. So yes, it's directly benefiting the community, but the developer has also lessened its risk through the payment process. So they get paid every month, and so those, as my students put it, those are the happy hats for each of the rest. All right, and the next one. I think we all know how renewable energy certificates work. Go ahead, you can, the sun creates energy, and it goes to the grid next, and the utility pays money back to the community, and that's solar energy. Which includes the renewable energy certificate, and if you want to sell the renewable energy certificate back to the utility for a little bit of money, then that means that, next one, and that means that when the RECs are sold, that the utility lowers its carbon footprint, and if the RECs are kept by the community, then the community lowers its carbon footprint. And so this is the slide that the communities see. This was our first project, but we've done this again for 3 other projects that we presented to and are in process, and to help them understand what they're choosing. So next slide. So a couple of the key characteristics is ownership. In 5 years, the cooperative will purchase this solar array using funding from the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. That means that they will receive the long-term benefit of the price stability and the price savings. The second is that it is actual solar, and one of the things that our research showed and a lot of interviews showed and has proven out in New Hampshire is that low-income and moderate-income people care about the climate too. They want to make a difference too. It's not just about the money. The last one, benefits need to be equitable. 45% of United States citizens or people can't ever use the federal tax credit. They don't ever have the income to do that. And the ability to get the rebate in New Hampshire made this project possible, and that kind of upfront return on the completion of the installation was a critical piece. Last slide. So just to reiterate a couple of the pieces that we've talked about. In Vermont, there's a penalty to keep your RECs and to go full solar. In New Hampshire, there's the same retail rate with or without the RECs. In Vermont, the Clean Energy Fund no longer does rebates. In New Hampshire, the Renewable Energy Fund does rebates, not just for low-income projects, but for other projects. Now, admittedly, those rebates are gone like almost instantaneously, which is why 15% being dedicated to low income was pretty critical in order to set aside money for those projects. On the group net metering, in Vermont, it's on-bill credit only, which is a good thing in the sense that you're not seeing 1099s come through with your income. But on the other hand, it doesn't allow for this kind of community project where you can have a funding source go directly to the community cooperative organization that can then distribute it. So that is a difference that's made it more difficult. And actually, to Kevin's point earlier, in New Hampshire, you can be in multiple groups. You can't be in multiple groups beyond what you use in a year, but you can actually be in multiple groups. I guess I have one more slide. So, to conclude and hit it one more time, walk back the rec penalties that prevent solar ownership, put incentives in place for low, moderate income participation. Those could be siting incentives, those could be adders, those could be rebates. There's a number of different ways it could do it. If we don't incentivize for low, moderate income participation, developers don't have any incentive to try and make it work. So it's just how it works. It's much easier to go to the rest of the world's. I'll leave it at that. So the last one, put the community back in group net metering. When we look at the group net metering in Vermont, I think that we should look at the statistics of how many of them are really truly community group net metering that benefit residents and how many of them are not. And perhaps in considering the number of participants in any given project, we could consider whether or not that justifies siting on farms or siting and benefiting farmers and other individuals that want to have these projects on their property. And the last is that I would encourage an understanding, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about on-bill tariffs and the opportunities that it presents for low and moderate income populations and renters. That's it.
Thank you. So our last presenter is Nathan Phelps from Vote Solar, and I'm so thankful that Nathan's with us because he has really not only regional experience but brings national expertise in what's going on in this space. And so let me take it away, Nathan. And while you're talking, I'm going to go write up some of the barriers and solutions I've heard thus far to facilitate our conversation. So don't be distracted by me making notes over there. Listen to Nathan.
Thank you, Olivia. Just real quickly, for those of you who don't know, Vote Solar, we're a national organization, we're a nonprofit, 501c3 to be exact. We are not a trade organization, to be clear. All we do is basically advocacy. I'm on the regulatory side, so you see me walking out with a lot of regulators on this type of stuff. So you've heard a lot of really good examples and kind of laying the foundation for why low-income solar is important, how it can bring incredible benefits to these customers. I'm just going to try to add a little additional color, put things together, and I'm not planning on speaking very long because I want to have a conversation with everyone about what you want to learn. So first, I just want to reiterate once again, you've heard it several times, but low-income customers are most vulnerable when it comes to their energy burden. Stated differently, they can benefit the most from solar. And so it's a perfect opportunity to really help these customers. The problem is actually figuring out how to do it. And many states, many organizations have been trying to figure out different ways to go about it. No one thus far has found any type of silver bullet, to be clear. Everyone's doing little things, different ideas, try to figure it out, try to make it work. And there's some great projects that have come out of it, some great work, a lot of really wonderful benefits that are going to low-income customers. I want to talk a little bit about some of the financial barriers. And they've been discussed. This isn't really anything new. And when you kind of come down to it, the financial barrier is the same for all customers. We're talking about a resource that has an upfront cost and then very little, virtually no, ongoing cost. And so we're upfront payment for long-term benefits. And that's true for anyone. But for low income, it's just heavily magnified for having that type of access to that capital in order to avail themselves of that long-term benefit. And while I completely agree incentives are necessary for low income, and they're very appropriate, I just want to note real quickly that we can't rely strictly on an additional incentive and expect that to solve all the problems. Because while an additional incentive is necessary, there are still non-monetary barriers that exist. And those need to be overcome also. So we've talked, for instance, about the community action agencies and how they are a great way to reach low-income customers and be the kind of voice and the messenger. Well, trust, understandably so, is a major issue when you're talking about trying to access these customers. And if you have, for instance, somebody that is unknown to them coming up to try to tell them that they're going to save a ton of money, there's probably going to be some skepticism there. So you really do need to overcome that trust issue. There's also other issues like risk. When you're talking about if they are able to access capital, say get a loan or something like that, you're putting them in a position where they have potentially another bill to pay. And while they, in this case, could have access to that capital, do we necessarily want to be putting them in that position? Because if you think about some of the other ramifications of this, the domino effect, if you will, let's say they are able to access a loan and get it, even if it's paid down through like a zero interest loan through some type of subsidy, you're potentially over leveraging them for other things that they may have to do in the future. And that could be stuff like buying a car to get to their job or something, whatever it is. But do we necessarily want to be putting them in that position even if we can? So you have to figure out what is most appropriate for trying to help these people. And I don't have the answer to that. A lot of people are working on it, but it's just something I want to make sure we're all at least cognizant of. So there's barriers that are financial, and there's barriers that are non-financial or non-monetary barriers. And then lastly, we've heard some discussion of community solar. I just want to note too that there is an opportunity for on-site behind-the-meter solar for low-income customers. And a quick poll. Who in here has heard of grid alternatives? Okay, a few of us. I think half of them were up here. But so grid alternatives, they're doing tremendous work. They started out in California. And essentially what they do, it's kind of similar to Habitat for Humanity. Basically, they get donations of solar panels, and then they get people to donate their time to come and install the equipment on people's homes. And it's amazing for the people that are able to participate in this program. Now, there are some issues with trying to bring that model into every state. So just an example, in Massachusetts, there's some requirements for electricians to be on site and prevailing wage, which has been a barrier to grid alternatives actually operating in Massachusetts. So, but I just want to bring up that is a model that's been out there. And California, as far as behind the meter low-income solar goes, is way ahead of everyone else, in large part because of grid alternatives. But that would never address all potential low-income customers because, as has been pointed out, there's a lot of renters. Think about affordable housing and how to access those customers. That behind the meter wouldn't necessarily work for them. And then there's other barriers too. I just can't help but throwing out that, you know, we do have, for instance, some customers, some low-income customers who actually don't pay an electric bill because it's built into their rent. Or, I was floored when I first learned about this, there's some programs that the total amount that that customer pays is basically the delta between their energy bills and whatever is they're set at. So basically, if their energy bill goes down, then their rent goes up. And so you have that kind of perverse incentive of like, if you're helping them on their energy bill, you're not actually helping their affordability at all. You're not, you may be changing their energy burden, but not their financial burden. So there's all these different problems. But fundamentally, when we talk about, you know, helping
the
out.
renter-owner split. Did everyone understand what he was just saying?
Yeah,
Sorry, I shouldn't have
No,
interrupted you,
please.
Nathan.
How does that work?
Yeah, you explain that a little more.
Okay, so let's say you're struggling and you're able to get into some affordable housing. Basically, the agreement when you enter the affordable housing is you are able to, because of your financial situation, you are able to pay X dollars per month for your combination of your energy expenses and your living expenses. And the way they calculate that X is basically, if I'm using algebra here, but basically your living expenses are X. If your energy expenses are Y, then the calculation of how much you pay in rent is X minus Y. And so when Y changes, it doesn't change the total amount that they're paying that month.
So your overall costs are directly related to what your income is. So if you're paying $400 a month, that's $400 a month for your rent and your energy. And if your energy goes down, then that just means that you're paying more in rent. So
Is that section 8 or is that something else?
Oh, I can't recall.
I think it's section 8.
Yeah, it sounds like section 8.
Section 8 cut out. It's a federal law. It's a federal formula.
Anyway, so once again, just to go back to the original point, these are the people that can benefit the most from solar, and we just need to figure out the mechanisms that will work in order to get solar for these customers. And it's not going to be uniform across the board. Low income is not uniform. You have people in cities that are low income, people in rural areas that are low income. It could be renters, it could be homeowners. It's all shapes and sizes. And so it's not necessarily like a singular program that's going to work for everyone.
And I'd also make the argument that we can't get where we need to go from an environmental and climate perspective unless our entire population is participating in it. And we need to find a way to help them participate so that we can get where we can go.
Yeah, there's also another link there too, which I don't want to take us too off track, but from an environmental justice perspective, there historically has been a pretty strong link between low-income people and environmental justice communities. And so when we're really talking about one, we could actually just be talking about both. And so linking those two may be an opportunity to kind of tackle two issues, if you will. Was I too quick?
I think so we've just heard a lot. Why don't let's open it up first to questions that folks may have for what they've heard, or ideas that may have spurred you based on what you've heard. Ben.
I think I understood everything, so I don't have a question, but so if you want me to go later, let me know. But
Let's go, Ben.
I've had an idea for a while, which is kind of falls into place with a lot of what we've been talking about. When it comes to making the benefits accessible to low, moderate income people, it seems to be very helpful to have money, not credits, to play with. Kind of what Krista said about New Hampshire is that the benefits from utility were money, not credits in your bill. And at the same time, like in in Chittenden County where I live, we have, and in the nearby kind of triangle of the biggest economic, the economic engine of Vermont, kind of, St. Albans, Middlebury, Montpelier. There's probably tens of megawatts of commercial rooftop solar capacity that never gets used because they're rented commercial buildings. The landlord, some landlords are very motivated, but mostly they don't want to change the lease arrangements with their tenants. Sometimes they don't want to put anything on the roof because they might change tenants. But so my thought is that if it was possible to, so the only way they could develop a project on that roof is to build it themselves, find off-takers, and give those off-takers a discount of 10 to 15%. So what I thought is that why don't we let them install the solar and get the full amount as a check and have to pay a tax of 10 to 15% that would go towards low, moderate income solar projects. But for that matter, just to add on to that, why don't we have any project that benefits some specified percentage of low, moderate income people defined as 300% of poverty, or Dr. Dinosaur in Vermont is 400% of poverty, and that those projects have a carve out to be able to get a check. There was some, was it like, Kevin, 7 years ago that Green Mountain Power was writing checks when you went over for the year? I don't remember how many years, but so it's been kind of done before.
So I'm just going to play a little bit devil's advocate and
please
point out two potential complications
Yes.
to that. The first is that when you start cutting checks to customers, there's a real risk that needs to be considered income.
Right.
And you actually do run a potential vulnerability of bumping them into a higher income bracket.
Right.
And in my mind, the worst case scenario would be actually bumping out their eligibility for other programs. So you could very unintentionally end up hurting the customer long term. Now that's going to vary on a customer by customer.
I was thinking that the developer or the owner of the commercial building who was not low income would be getting the check. And then, but maybe to your point, instead of, and then they would be paying, so they would be, yes, they would get more income than if it was net metering credits, I guess. So that would be an extra expense to the project, good point. But then the taxes would just be a tax that would go to a fund, a state-run fund.
I think having the option to have dollars or on-bill credits and being able to make that decision based on an individual circumstance, it is absolutely true that on-bill credit is a really important mechanism, especially for individual solar and even for some group net metering solar. But there are a lot of opportunities that are missed because we don't have a flexible system that allows entities to elect one or the other. And it isn't that complicated for the utility. The utilities in Vermont are already doing the complicated version, right? The utilities in New Hampshire are saying, no, we don't want to do on-bill crediting because then we have to redo our whole billing system and it's going to cost us so much money, and they're totally fighting it. They just want to cut the check at the end of the day. And there's a push and there's a pilot to try and get them to do on-bill crediting so that people don't have to suffer from the income impact of getting it, so that it's really just a decrease in their expense. And so I'm not in any way disparaging on-bill crediting. I think it's a really important part of it. But the flexibility to have both is really, really important.
And sitting right next to a lawyer, I'm about to enter into very dangerous waters. But there is another complicating factor, and I run the risk of putting you all to sleep, so bear with me. But basically, federal law, PURPA, Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, basically caps what you can pay a person for the monetary value, and it's the voided cost. And so you run the risk if your net metering credit value is higher than a voided cost. If you're trying to cash that out, then you run the risk of violating federal law. So.
Is there a threshold, like a system size threshold for that? I mean, you know, it's generally 150 kilowatts is tiny in the realm of PURPA.
In New Hampshire, the net metering is capped at 1 megawatt.
No,
but I'm going back to that. So, and the way that it works in New Hampshire is that if at the end of the year, the net metering, so there are still groups, right? And there's still groups that have utility bills. If the total kilowatt hour usage of everyone in that group does not meet the energy output that that array produced,
right,
then that net difference, is got to be paid back. Now, they don't pay it back, they pay back the delta between the avoided cost and the net metered rate. So it's important to make sure that your group stays large enough that you're always, exceeding the production of the community solar array.
right.
And provided you do that, then you can stay at that net metered rate and receive that check on a monthly basis. But if you, at the end of the year, if you have, if your production has exceeded your community, then you will have to pay back down to whatever the avoided cost rate for the utility is.
So they're getting the same rate as they would for net metering, except they're getting it as a check, with the same limitations that they have to have the usage to offset.
Correct. At the end of the year, which is similar here in that it's 12 months rolling, but there it's exactly.
Anyone else? Questions, ideas?
Question for Krista. I'm intrigued by the project that you were talking about in New Hampshire and having the developer be involved in that direct payment. I would expect that sort of arrangement would enable them to get a loan to finance the program at a lower interest rate. I was wondering if that was the case or if you could speak to that.
Yeah. So the way the program works is that, I was going to draw it, but I'll use my hands. The way the program works is that contractually, the payment goes from the utility to the cooperative, and then contractually, the cooperative pays the developer and pays its community members. The way the actual dollars flow is that the utility pays the developer as the fiscal agent of the cooperative, and the developer puts that money into the cooperative's bank account and writes sells a check, writes the cooperative a check, which they then distribute. So that's I just want to make that point because that was an important part of setting it up for the developer to be happy that they didn't have to rely on the community to decide that they actually did want to send the check that month, that they had that guarantee of being paid, but that the community itself is still direct benefit and contractually in control. The second piece to your point is that because of that arrangement and decreasing the risk of the project, they were able to do two things. One, they were able to get community loan financing at a lower interest rate. And two, they're able to leverage impact investors willing to take a lower interest rate. Now, when we talk about impact investors, it's an investor that's willing to take 9% instead of 17% because it's for a low-income purpose. It's, or it's for a community purpose or that kind of thing. So that's what we talk about when we mean impact investors. And not everybody wants to be an impact investor, and they don't need to be right now. There's plenty of other opportunities for them to invest in other places. But for those people that are contributing to these types of communities anyway. It's an opportunity to get a solid return with low risk and feel-good benefit.
Can I just highlight one thing that Krista just brought up? In New Hampshire, the developer is able to receive the funds. So we did a project in Wilder where the funds would have actually, disbursements would have gone to the individuals in a mobile home park. And then it's up to some entity to then bill them and get the money back to then pay the developer, which is a, yes, it's a nightmare, and it's harder to explain to financing institutions that this is, you know, that the developer is going to get repaid.
Right.
So, you know, if we can clean that up, that's just money kind of, you know, that's money lost because you might get charged a higher interest rate, or you might have to set aside some reserve fund. It's a barrier. So I really, the concept of being able to have the flexibility to have either credits or the ability to have some type of monetary outpay from the utility to some entity really makes a lot of sense.
An interesting point from the community, when we first went into the Muskoma Meadows community, you know, we did a lot of community presentations, and my students that semester were horrified at the idea that I was actually going to put these two, because the New Hampshire was doing a low-income working group, so they didn't know how this program was going to be set up yet. And so what the commission had originally said was this whole program is supposed to be about on-bill crediting, and that's what we're going to do. It's going to be an on-bill credit program. And so we went to the community, and I said, bear with me, but I'm going to walk you through the two options that you have. Either it's going to be credited on your bill, and then you are going to pay your cooperative, basically by paying higher lot rent, and then your cooperative will pay for the energy. Or you are going, so in other words, you get a lower electric bill, but you're going to have a higher rent bill. Or you're going to get the same electric bill, but a lower rent bill. Does it make a difference? Like, I didn't think it would make a difference. Hands down, every single person was like, absolutely, you can increase my lot rent. Don't increase my lot rent. I mean, it's just that there is a perspective, right? And those things do matter to them. So when we're talking about low income, that's the low income community's perspective, and it happens to mesh with the developer's perspective. So worth thinking about.
Other ideas or questions?
I have a very short question. The developer got some of the money as cash, right, as a check, right? Did they have to pay income tax on that then?
So the entity, the cooperative, is the one that's receiving the money from and paying. The cooperative is receiving the money, and they're paying contractually. They're receiving the money, and they are paying the utility, and then they are making payments out to their people, to their residents. And so we haven't gone through a tax cycle yet, but according to the accountants that we worked with, the payments out to the utility and the payments out to the individuals will all be expenses, and so there will be as much expense as there is income, and therefore there shouldn't be a tax impact. And it's a cooperative, so there's that too. So, so that's the way we think it's going to work. But we went live in December, and so our first check isn't due for a couple of weeks, and then we'll see how the year goes. But theoretically, there shouldn't be a tax impact. But that being said, it is an income. There will be a 1099 at the end of the year if you don't have the offsetting expenses. That's why we set it up with the host as the cooperative, because they would have the offsetting expenses. To New Hampshire's power purchase agreement state, it's different from Vermont, so that's different than here. But that's the way it works there.
Just kind of quick follow-up on that. What about the money that the developer is taking from that as contracted through the PPA?
So what they receive for the power purchase agreement, that's income that they have to address. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That would be the same as any PPA.
Yeah.
So I have a question before we wrap up and kind of summarize what we've heard today. What of the different projects and things that we've heard, are there elements that you think are, you know, most replicable or scalable? You know, because I think a lot of times what we see with efforts to expand the access to everyone for solar is that projects end up being a pilot project here, a pilot project there, and then have a great challenge in terms of replicating themselves or in terms of scaling to benefit more people. Do you guys have any thoughts on that, or maybe even, Nathan, examples you've seen from other states around that issue?
So, bringing something to scale is always kind of the difficult part of developing a policy. That's why, you know, pilots are good, because you can learn from them and then figure out how to roll it out to a larger group. I don't necessarily have any great examples for community solar, but for the behind the meter, I would say look at California and their SASH program. And SASH is an acronym, and I can't remember what it stands for right now, but that program has been quite successful for behind the meter projects for low income. The community solar aspect of low income has been a little bit more difficult to bring to scale, and that's probably in no small part because community solar is younger than, hasn't been around as long as behind the meter solar. But an example of something that did not work.
Outside of Vermont. Originally, right?
An example of a program that did not work is Colorado. So when Colorado first passed their community solar bill, and this was back in 2010 if I remember correctly, there was originally a provision that I think it was 10% of all community solar projects had to go to low-income customers. And basically, the community solar developers couldn't figure out a way to actually make that any type of profitable exercise. So essentially what they did was they would end up giving away 10% of the production of their community solar facilities to low-income customers. That's not a terrible outcome, in all honesty. That's really, it could have been a lot worse. But ultimately what came of that is Colorado passed a new law, basically pulled out the low-income portion of the community solar and gave it to the utilities. Because they were like, basically what we're seeing here is a market failure. And we're going to put the utilities in charge of it in order to address the market failure. And it's too early to determine whether or not the utilities are doing a good job with it. But that's an example of how it didn't really
evolved,
work.
yeah. Krista?
I think that brings up a really important point about the transaction costs on community solar and the importance of the intermediary organization. So whether it's the cooperative in this situation or the community action agency or housing development or whatever kind of entity, that entity that can bring together a group of community people, it could be a town, it could be a municipality, it could be a school, it could be an energy committee, it could be any of these numbers of things, but you need to have that entity that brings those people together, that creates that group, that gets that paperwork and that headache done, because the developer's not going to do it. From a transaction cost basis, they can go and get, single people, businesses with 10 different meters to come together for a much easier, lower cost in terms of putting the contracts together. So we need to have those intermediary groups participate and pull people together and get them on board. And to do that, they need to understand how they can do that and what those contracts look like. And hopefully that's one of the things that that Steve's group and that the law school and the other entities can do, is to help educate and create sample forms and sample contracts and walk people through the process. One of the things that we're doing Dave's my key person on this, is creating a guide, and we're going for New Hampshire, and we'll give that to Rock, New Hampshire. That's the residential-owned communities of New Hampshire, and they have a person that goes in and is the on-hands person with each of these cooperative communities. In New Hampshire, there's 127 of them. That's 127 opportunities to have a cooperative group that's going to work on these projects. They don't all have land. We're working with how do we find land, but this one didn't have land. I mean, I didn't even go into the tear-jerking part of this. This community was given the land next door by the church. They didn't just give it. The community came together as a whole. You saw everybody in that room, and that was put in front of them. Are you willing to pay market value for this piece of land? Are you willing to pay $30,000? They all voted to pay $30,000 for this half-acre piece of land so that they could put community solar on. And the pastor of the church got up and said, we voted, and we decided that if you made the decision to invest in yourselves, then we would give you the property because you made the decision to invest in yourselves. And I mean, there wasn't a dry eye in the house.
I just got chills.
So anyway, it's the community that needs to pull people together.
Do you want to
Go to
add
Clary
in
and then you,
Marcy's
Lori.
point about needing that third party? We, like SunCommon, we also figured that out. We figured out how to be a developer that also offered the contracts and the way to bring people together. That year that we had Community Solar Live, I think that we were something like 12% of nationwide community solar happened in Vermont under us. Like, it's possible.
So with the project that you did, partnering with Green Mountain Power, I mean, what is the barrier to doing more of those types of projects?
Yeah, the reason that one's not easily repeatable is because of the price that that Green Mountain Power charged for using their roof. So it goes back to that problem of there are those commercial roofs out there that most owners don't want to build solar on. So Green Mountain Power was willing to, it was practically a donation, the way that they made their roof available to low and moderate income households.
So could it be that what about, I've been thinking about, you know, the roof space, like looking in my hometown, Montpelier. You know, there's a lot of state office buildings, there's school buildings, there's municipal buildings. Have there been models where, you know, maybe the town or the school board votes to say, yeah, we're going to allow we're going to allow it on our property under these conditions, or maybe even offering those properties for lease to someone to do it privately? Have we seen that nationally, or could that be a solution?
I absolutely think it could. I think that was one of the case studies that we looked at as a group, the Energy Access Coalition, was around using municipal rooftops for community solar, I think. So yeah, I think that's a really smart model. That's often difficult projects to do because of needing third party, like the key there is third party financiers.
Yeah,
when you're working with a municipal.
I'll just jump in here. So one of the things I'm really proud of as a select board member, we actually hired an energy coordinator for our town, and one of the things that he identified in Hartford was that we were having this piece of land beside a mobile home park, which was our water facilities, and we chose as a town, rather than have the offset solar that was going to be built there go back to the town or the municipality, to instead create a community solar array program for the residents of that mobile home park. And it's exactly what Jim was saying. We had Norwich Technologies do it, but the fact that we as a community chose to do that, I feel is very unique, because there are lots of municipalities where the selling point on solar is you're going to be saving taxpayers when you put this on your police department building or your wastewater, versus what we chose to do, which was to directly give it back to the residents of that community.
And if I could pile on to Becca's statement, I actually think that there are some towns, could be Hartford, that is actually updating their municipal energy plan, which everyone is doing right now, to basically offer up rooftop space, municipal rooftop space for community solar. So I think there's two takeaways there. I always say it when I'm in a meeting, Jeff Martin, the energy coordinator at Hartford, is a great guy, and it is very unique in Vermont to actually have somebody coordinating the energy policy. So Hartford has a lot of stuff going on directly applicable to the foresight of hiring that position and for Jeff. And as a result, they're aligning public policy and things that they can do in ways to help the community and all spectrums of the income range.
Well, it sounds like we should, as a coalition, should definitely look at that more and share that with others. So thank you guys for bringing that up.
Kind of adding to the municipal piece, I think that it really helps capture that invaluable trust and educational normalization aspect. The more, especially like children growing up with a solar array in their schoolyard or on their school roof and learning about that early, it builds that trust, and it turns solar into this thing that they grow up with, as opposed to this thing that shows up and it's scary and new. And there's the whole trust aspect, which is a major aspect in the low income development of solar.
Okay. Oh, Lori, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, just, that's a good point, but, Vermont's small, and so, everything's kind of about scale.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the reason these are hard to replicate, is because every community's different, every project's different. Even if you're looking at residential, every project's different. I mean, they're little construction projects. So I really think it's important to think about simplicity when you're developing or changing policy, making it so that it's understandable for just the general public, because it gets pretty wonky pretty quick and people lose interest.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's important to know, and also to know that there is going to be a range. We're, like I said, Vermont's a small town, right? So we have populations, that just a huge range of socioeconomic population here in pretty much every corner, whether it's Chittenden County or Caledonia County. So there's going to be options that meet everybody's needs or could meet everybody's needs. But simplicity and the ability for all of us to be able to describe it, even people in this room had trouble kind of describing it or getting your head around it. I think that's an important factor to take into account when we're talking about making policy changes, and especially impacting that lower to moderate income population. That's a huge part of who lives
Keeping
here.
it simple. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but I like really the fact that you mean keeping it simple for the customers and our neighbors who are benefiting. Also keeping it simple for our rules and regulations, and keeping it simple for those that are moving forward to create these benefits. One thing that is interesting, it's too bad Kevin isn't still here, but one of the things that I heard was the difference between the challenges in the permitting and the time versus the actual construction and the doing, the action. So maybe Clary or Krista, you guys could answer too. I just note as a barrier, complicated rules, but also complicated permitting, which, one takes time, and two really increases costs. Are there solutions, or what, do you guys want to share your thoughts around that?
The way it stands now, so when the community solar permitting basically changed, we had 20 applications that were canceled. That was there would have been something like 600 families that could have joined community solar array. So that comes down to incentives. It is cumbersome. I don't have the specifics on how that policy can change.
Krista?
Yeah, I mean, it's a major shift in how Vermont's treating its projects, and I think that if you want to do, that's where I come back to put the community back in community solar. Like if you have an increased transaction cost when you bring a bunch of different people into a project. If that project can have a decreased permitting cost, and by decreased I mean what we had a year ago, not like some special thing. But when we shifted the permitting down to 100, it's 100, right? 150. then it really impacted those community solar projects that are in that 150 to 500 kilowatt range that before were going through effectively an application process and now have a $30,000 bill to pay in order to do the experts. I've been out of the industry a couple of years, so yeah, a little higher. So that's a really major impact in community solar when you're looking at 150 to 500 kilowatts.
Plus, not to add on to what I've got to Chris, but anyways, the rates went down at the same time, so your net meter credit that you were paid lowered at the same time. You just added on a lot of incremental costs to develop those projects.
Yeah. So you're not going to take on those extra transactional costs to do those community projects.
Well, what I want to do is wrap up a little bit of what we've heard today and be respectful of everyone's time because, we'll be here for additional questions and we'll definitely have follow-up other meetings for the low-income work group about digesting what we've heard and how can we share that and how can we address, maybe move some of these solutions forward that we've identified to address the barriers. But we had a pretty consistency about housing instability on our barriers, limits, changes to the net metering rule related to limits on bill credit allocations, limiting customers to only participate in one net metering group, the concept that solar, while it certainly is a short-term benefit, it's definitely an investment for long-term benefit, and thinking about our neighbors that have real challenges day-to-day in the short term, that with that long term. I loved how Kristen was like, invest in yourself, but that is not always possible for too many folks, unfortunately. Penalty, this is specific to Vermont, penalties for not giving direct to utilities, the challenge about trust and validation of benefits, which is particularly important with the neighbors that we're trying to help. The renter-owner split, I know particularly that, there are renters in every community. However, we have some folks, even in Burlington, where 60% of the population is renters. And so thinking, about that renter-owner split and the challenges there, and complicated rules and permitting. And we've identified quite a few solutions that we've our projects have deployed some of the pilots, or we've learned and heard from other states. I'm going to go over here. We're using municipal school buildings for rooftops. We should look more at Hartford and what they've done. Encouraging inclusion of that in our town energy plans that are underway, and maybe also following up with the regional energy plans that have already been completed. Connecting with energy efficiency. I know that that's something that the CAP agencies always do, as energy first and efficiency first. Looking at who really qualifies, both the cliff and the folks that maybe don't even consider themselves as low income. Given the fact that so many folks, as that's a pretty shocking statistic for me, thinking about 45% of our neighbors cannot access the federal tax credit. That has really driven participation in solar to date, and also in electric vehicles, though we're not talking about that right now. So looking at qualifying, 300% of poverty level was an example that was used in New Hampshire and other states. Sliding scale credits and benefits, third-party validation of a project, and maybe that is working with a third party like a CAP, a neighborhood association, utility to either act as a host or a partner in the project, or maybe having a third party as an intermediary organization. This seems like that could go a lot of different ways around third party validation. Let's see, what else we have? Cash out on bill credits. We heard about interest rate buy downs or investor security funds. It would be interesting maybe to hear more take lessons that have been learned in our very successful efficiency programs and see how they might apply also to renewable electricity like solar and transportation. We should think about that as a solution. Looking at the California SASH program, and over here, preferred siting and permitting for community, meaning residential and low-income projects, on-bill financing to the meter pays model. We do actually have a case study about that on our website, revermont.org, and there's another work group of our coalition that is really diving deep into that one that Chris is on. So maintaining virtual group net metering, enabling extra net metering credits to go to low moderate income. There's some thoughts about a reserve, certain percentage of a solar array for low moderate income households. It was interesting, with your project, you had a percentage of the array that went there, but the other, who, was it the anchor, or who, how did that work with the other, you know,
For us,
customer?
50% got to be people in our wait list. that
Okay.
signed up in 2015.
Okay, so the combination of leveraging other customers that may not be LMI. Allowing light heat funds for solar. This was really interesting to hear about from Real. And I've already taken the step to try to contact, we've got Senator Leahy's office looking into that for us to see if we can overcome that as a barrier. And identifying impact investors was also a solutions or a best practice that's needed. So thank you guys so much for participating in the conversation. We'll definitely be following up. And I also appreciate there's quite a bit of materials to grab, in addition to extra cookies, hot chocolate coffee in the back. So we'll follow up with the notes here, and if you're sign up if you want to get that information so that we can keep you in the loop on this. And if you know also of anyone, partnering organization that would like to join the coalition, please share that with us, and we'd be happy to reach out with them to keep this conversation going. So we'll be here, and thanks everyone.